Welcome back. So today we're going to talk about Hernan Losada, who last week was fired by DC United after only been in the job for 15 months, and this came only a couple of days after the San Jose Earthquakes fired Matias Almeyda, and that it's hard to believe that we're only a quarter into the season, but we already have two head coaches that have been fired by their team. I mean, I know I've said before that the coaching turnover in MLS is really kind of at an all-time high, but I definitely did not expect the fact that after just kind of 9 games into the season for most of these teams, that we already have two teams that is looking for a new head coach to either salvage their season or maybe just act like this is kind of like a throwaway season for them. Now, in the case of Hernan Losada, I mentioned the fact that his firing from this DC job was kind of almost similar, where he had some ongoing feud with the front office, with the front office not providing the resource for him to really guide this DCT back to the playoffs. But there was also one thing that I didn't mention when I talked about the fire of Hernan Losada in the news of the week episode that kind of maybe changed my perspective of why exactly Losada was let go of DC, and maybe kind of one of the big reasons why he was fired after just being in the job for 15 months. Now, during those 15 months, his final coaching record was 16, 19, and 5, so definitely not good. But a lot of that with him end up to be below 500 in terms of his coaching record is that this team basically lost 4 in a row to start this season. Though last season they also didn't finish above 500, as they finished 14, 5, and 15, and finished with 47 points under his first year. Though you got to say that seems like an improvement, and especially with the way that DC, they were very unfortunate to not make it to the playoffs. I mean, on that decision day game, I mentioned how they pretty much did everything they need to do, which is get the win against Toronto FC and hope that Nashville SC can help them out a little bit by beating the New York Red Bulls at home. And unfortunately, that did not happen, and they of course miss out on the playoffs by just a single point. Now in 2022, after a promising start to the season, this is when the wheels kind of came off, where they lost 4 in a row to start the season, and they've only have 6 points. But even then, you kind of don't expect the fact that, yes, I mean, the start of the season for DC has not been great, and there's definitely telling sign that this could be another rough year for this team. But it was still kind of surprising the fact that DC immediately just swing the hammer and decide to chop her and Lasat the heads off, and basically decide to move on to a new head coach. Actually, that did not sound correctly, but I would say that I was kind of maybe a little bit surprised that DC immediately decided to fire Lasada so close, and especially I mentioned how that with them making this move, they also are open in terms of being criticized by the fans, because I mentioned before, after their long coaching candidate search that they had throughout the off season in 2021. Just firing Losada after just short of a spell after when they went for that long coaching search, and they think that they finally found the right man, they better stick with him, or else the fans are not going to be happy, and rightfully so. The fans were definitely not happy with how the front office decided that, yeah, you went for this long coaching search for pretty much the whole off season, and you bought in a guy that didn't even last a year and a half, and that the fans have already started to lose a lot of belief in this front office. But this probably maybe could be one that you can definitely see some DC fans are not only not happy about their front office, but they're straight on almost at the same level of how the Quakes fan base are, where the Quakes fan base have been ongoing protesting in terms of the front office, and especially the owner. Now, in terms of the highlights of his tenure with DC United, because anytime when a coach being fired, I still would want to talk about some of the highlights that he has, and he definitely had some highlights with this DC team. I mean, the tactics that he used was a very kind of high pressing, high octane kind of style, where it's like non-stop pressing and trying to attack as much as possible. And in some way, for part of the last season, it worked out perfectly, because teams just could not deal with the press that Losada team usually put, and that in some way they kind of play some of the most innovative and entertaining soccer in the league, which DC fans would desperately want to see. I mean, they've suffered so much under the Ben Olsen era, especially the year, which turns out to be his last. Of how he was not only running the team to the ground but playing in some of the most boring soccer as imagined. DC fans were desperate in terms of some change, and they definitely got some change from Hernan Losada with them just playing some very beautiful soccer at time. But that being said, as we'll talk about what went wrong, that beautiful soccer definitely does come with a cost. And then he guided this DC team within a whisker of making the playoffs despite having almost the same squad as Ben Olsen. Like, when you look at the squad that Hernan Losada basically brought in, it was a very Ben Olsen kind of team. They didn't really make a lot of signing last season, that is DC, to trying to improve the team. So in the in the way that, with how Losada really transferred to this team to being the most boring team to watch, the most exciting team to watch in just a single year, that is definitely very impressive. But also with the way that they came close in terms of making the playoffs too. I mean, ideally, if they did make it to the playoffs, it would have been a much better achievement. But the fact that they were literally knocking on the door to do so, and not to mention, this DC team last season, it was an all great start for Hernan Losada in his tenure with DC. I mean, during his first year, they really gone through a very rough patch, and then they just kind of had that crazy resurgence in the summer to really get themselves in a good position in the playoffs, but ultimately basically falling in the last hurdle, which again, that sounds very familiar to Matias Almeyda, especially Almeyda's first year when his first couple of games was an absolute disaster. Then they had that crazy summer kind of resurgence, got the Quakes as high as second in the Western Conference before completely collapsing in the latter part of the season. Now, what went wrong for Hernan Losada that kind of led to his downfall? Similar to Almeyda's tenure with the Quakes, Losada had that feel with the front office of lack of signing. And while I said about, Almeyda, it's kind of a double-edged sword where, yes, in some way, the Quakes front office was cheap and did not really give as much for Almeyda to kind of build the team. But at the same time, when you look at some of the signing that Almeyda has gotten, especially getting his guys, you could question that in some way he did get his guys, and his guys just did not perform. With Losada, though, I would say that he actually straight up just did not get any support from the front office. Like I said, the squad that he basically had last season was really the same squad that Ben Olsen basically was using, and that it was pretty clear that the DC front office just did not give enough to Losada to really bring in the guys that he wants that will work perfectly in the system. But that being said, getting to the second point of the downfall of Losada, and this is where it gets to the point where I didn't mention in the news of the week, which I think this really plays a big part besides the ongoing feud with him and the front office. And that, of course, is the development story saying that Losada actually decided to use Gabriel Heinze's style of training and nutrition demands to his players. And what that basically means is, Gabriel Heinze, when he got fired from Atlanta United, and why exactly that was the case? Yeah, it's because, the players absolutely hated his training style, and that, there was that whole meme about how he wasn't allow his player to drink water and basically limit the amount of water that is implemented. Now, I don't think that was the same case with Losada. But one thing about Losada is that his training style was very brutal, and there was a lot of DC players that were not happy about it, and that the nutrition demands was also so brutal too. And I've heard there was report suggesting that Losada was demanding for his players to keep in the best physical shape, and that they had to kind of wait twice a week to make sure that is the case. And if they don't meet that demand, they of course would be fined because of it. So yeah, I mean, it feels very similar to the whole Gabriel Heinze situation, and that unsurprisingly, like Gabriel Heinze when he was in time with Atlanta United, and the players absolutely hated that. The same goes with those DC players. Like, those DC players were absolutely fuming with the unrealistic kind of style of training and nutrition demands their head coach basically is. And then it just kind of also get to a point where you can definitely see these players were not playing for Losada because of the way that they don't like the style that he was implemented, and that there's even in some players that kind of had speaks out on it. Though I know recently one of the players that have speaks out on it was Julian Gresso, who he of course has his own podcast talk about the whole Losada the kind of training style and the nutrition demands. And he said some positive thing that although it definitely got him to the best shape as possible, it was very demanding, and that there was a lot of players that were not happy about it, and even complained to the front office about it. And again, I think this is something that I think many foreign coach needs to understand about MLS, where you can't simply just do what you did in Europe, or what some of these coaches did in Europe, where we've seen some of these coaches in Europe decide to kind of have those double training kind of session, and that it tends to be very intense. And while that of course works out over in Europe, it does not work out in terms of what is going on in MLS, and that you're seeing that these head coaches that decide to do those kind of training, it just hasn't worked out for them. Now, I will say that, I'm not sure if any other coach basically decided to do that, and that one of the interesting thing that it also was pointed out in that same article that I read about this situation is that I think this would never have been a problem if this team would be winning. I mean, if this team was actually winning, nobody will talk about the training style and the nutrition demand that Losada basically put. But the problem with this DC team is that they're not winning, and when you're not winning, there's going to be some scapegoats that is going to be pointed out, and it seems like this was one of the biggest point that was pointed out with Losada, of the fact that he basically run his team to the ground, and it's no wonder why this team had so much injuries that they had to deal with last season, because when you decided to kind of run your team to the ground and decide to go with that hardcore style training, you're basically forcing your players to really be at the best fitness. And I'm pretty sure that even with some of these players in the best fitness, and I'm talking about these DC players, they just simply cannot meet that unrealistic demand. And then the other thing that went wrong for him is the naive tactical approach throughout his short tenure. Again, I mentioned it many times. He, alongside with Matias Almeyda, probably are some of the most stubborn head coach in MLS right now, where they tend to like to stick with their main tactics, and they don't want to adjust. And while I mentioned the high pressure pressing system that Losada used for DC was highly successful when teams couldn't figure it out, once teams started to figure out and had a book on it, and that's when this DC team really started to struggle, and this is when you start to see the flaws of the Losada system, and that since he never was able to adapt to those flaws, that's why this team really started to struggle. But also, again, a lot of that part isn't just because of the flaws, but also the players just simply hated the system, because it just doesn't work well with how they play. And then the last thing, of course, again, pretty much lost the locker room because of the second point, and maybe even the third point too, with the tactical approach, where some of these players, they don't want to play under this high octane kind of style, because they're just going to be dead tired by the time the second half begins for each of these games. Now, what's next for DC United? Well, obviously, Chad Ashton, as I mentioned, he's now the interim head coach once again, coming in for an interim basis. Now, the last time that Chad Ashton was an interim head coach for DC, it was just the last couple of games after Ben Olsen was fired at the end of the year. This DC team actually did well, and this is why it also kind of just skipped to the third point before I talk about who they're actually linked with, is that I still think they can still make a run for the playoffs. I mean, I think when you look at this team, it definitely has talent, and not to mention they've just got their recent DP player arrived to this team in Taxi Fuentes, and that we already saw how he had a dream debut, and that it's going to be very easy for DC fans to say that, oh, this is going to be an incredible signing for us, because when you have a player that has a dream debut, it kind of makes that point, and I'll be interested to see whether or not if he can keep this up. But if he can definitely keep this up, or even show half of what he did during his debut, this team is a very talented team. Like, this team has a good defense, good midfield, and on the attacking front, if Fuentes alongside with Ola Kamara continue to score goals, this team could definitely be a playoff team. And it also was shown in the last game where Chad Ashton, he didn't really do much different in that game. Like, when I watched that game, it feels like DC was still using the Losada system, but just it feels like Chad Ashton kind of tickled it a little bit, where it doesn't just go all out pressing for the most part of the game, and that there's times where there's flexibility of when exactly Chad Ashton want his team to press and when exactly it's time to kind of drop off and maybe trying to sit deep a little bit. And that's kind of the other reason why that I feel like maybe Chad Ashton might get a shot in an MLS head coach soon, because I remember when he came in for Ben Olsen, he really guided this team so close of making the playoffs too. I mean, people forget that before last year on decision day, the previous year, DC also had a big decision day game against Montreal, where if they could have won that game, and depending on how the result favored them, they would have made it to the playoffs when it looked like they were dead and buried under the last couple of months of Ben Olsen. And now the fact that DC has pretty much almost the entire year, and that if they do stick with Chad Ashton, that has been proven that he can be a decent head coach in MLS. Maybe some people might maybe thinking about adding him on the candidate list, and maybe he can potentially be a guy that I know he's been a long time assistant for this DC team, but there's no doubt that from what he's shown on an interim basis, I think he at least deserves a shot of being a permanent head coach. Which, that also being said, maybe DC might think about promoting him as a permanent head coach. I mean, we've seen it before with RSL and Vancouver decided to do so. So we'll see whether or not if that is going to be the case, or it kind of leads to the next point where, like the Quakes, DC is linked with Hugo Perez and Luchi Gonzalez as their next head coach. Now, I think the one that would make more sense would be Hugo Perez, because with Luchi Gonzalez, he's really a guy that works well with young players. And when you look at this DC team, yes, there's some young players on this team, but I don't think Luchi Gonzalez is going to be a good fit for DC if they decide to hire him. And that I've said before that if Luchi Gonzalez does go to the Quakes, it's a much better fit, because the Quakes, it seems like they're starting to finally admit that, yeah, you know what, if we're going to be cheap, we might as well just kind of do the same approach the Philadelphia Union and even FC Dallas approach, which is we're going to invest in our academy and bring in those talent to hope to make the team decently. But that just doesn't seem like it's going to work with DC, because DC does have some decent player coming out of their academy too, but not in a way where it's as advanced as what we even see the Quakes right now. So if there's one guy that out of those two head coaches that I think would makes perfect sense, it would be Hugo Perez. I mean, DC is home of a lot of El Salvadorian in population, and that if they bring in Hugo Perez, who I'm pretty sure that's going to really welcome the El Salvador fan base to attend the games, because I know the El Salvadorians are really loving Hugo Perez, and especially what he has done to the national team. And really, this is really the best period that the El Salvadorian national team has ever been through. So yeah, I think this would have definitely makes perfect sense. Though again, with Hugo Perez, it's gonna be interesting to see who, of course, would get it, because while Hugo Perez, he has that Bay Area tie, and that even his one of his son is a head coach and owner of a lower league team that is called Bay City FC. I won't be surprised if he does decide to come to DC and reconnect with that El Salvadorian population that is very popular in the DC area. But there you have it. That is pretty much it in terms of looking at what went wrong for Hernan Losada. Let me know in the comments below, what do you think of this video? And if you're a DC fan, I mean, what do you think is going to be the future of this team? I mean, this team for the last couple of years, it's been kind of weird, where there's been times where they have looked good, and then there's been times that they just suck badly. And that now that when you look at this DC team, I mean, the other thing you also kind of have to wonder is what their vision is going to be. Is this going to be a team that could get themselves back into the playoff position? But let me know in the comments below. But yeah, hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I will see you guys next time.